Hello, this is Dr. James Camp from Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is my comparison of Python and C++ as programming languages. First off, where did they come from? C++, as you probably know, was named after the C language. Um, it originated in the 1970s to 1980s, early 1980s. C++ 2.0 came out in around 1990, and the C++ language was standardized in 1998 with a major update in 2011 and minor updates every 3 years after that. Python, on the other hand, was named after the British comedy troupe Monty Python, and it originated in the late 1980s to 1991, so it's about uh, half a decade older, or half a decade newer than C++. Python 2.0 came out in about 2000, again about 10 years later than C++ 2.0. And then there was a Python 3.0 that came out in 2008, which is not backward compatible with the older versions of Python. So you have to know whether the language you're learning is Python 2.x or Python 3.x, because they're not necessarily compatible with each other. Python is currently on version 3.10.4. Both of them are what we call multi-paradigm languages. You can do procedural programming without any objects, or you can do object-oriented programming. However, a lot of the modules that people get Python to use are object-oriented by default. So you need to at least know how to interact with Python objects to do much Python programming. C++ is a compiled language where Python is interpreted. C++ tries to be efficient and fast and puts an emphasis on clever programming tricks, whereas Python tries to be simple and readable. C++ is known for having an extensive standard library. Python has an even bigger standard library. So now I'm going to go through some of the syntax for using C++ versus Python. If you're a C++ programmer like me, you know that you begin every program by pound including libraries and possibly other headers that you've written yourself. In Python, you're going to import library files. So you might import math, in which case you would have math.py, for example. You can import math as a shortcut letter, m, say, in which case you now can refer to m.py. Okay. You can say from math import pi, and then you don't have to use math.py at all. You can just say pi. And you can even import pi as capital Pi if you want to. So there are actually 4 different ways to import stuff from a Python library. Variables and input. You don't have to give types to numbers in Python. Num equals 42 will automatically set the type to int. However, when you read input, all input in Python, at least Python 3, is typed as a string. So you have to specifically tell it to convert that string to a float. So num2 is not just input, but it's float of input of give me a number. C++, you know how we've been using cout statements through the entire class with these less than output operators. In Python, you use a print function to print output. Print by itself just prints a new line. Print hello world will print hello world and give it a new line. If you don't want a new line at the end of your print, you have to actually go to the end of this slide here and say end equals quote. You have to say end equals something other than a new line. You can print hello plus something else, or you can print my age is, comma, age. Okay. And there's even a way of interpolating variables into strings by using the F before the string, which is kind of advanced Python, and I don't use it all that often. Okay, Python has all the same operators as C++, except in Python, division always defaults to floating point division, unless you use the floor or integer division operator, a double slash. There is a remainder operator in Python, and there's even a power operator in Python if you do 2 stars in a row. 2 star star 4 is 2 to the 4th power. Okay. Python uses equals equals and not equals for comparison. It uses less, less equal, greater, greater equals. It uses the keywords and, or, and not instead of C++'s ampersand, ampersand, bar, bar, and exclamation point. And Python actually allows you to string together multiple comparisons in one number sentence. So you can say A is less than B is less than C. Where in C++ you would have to say A less than B and B less than C. Conditionals, you simply say if A less than B, colon. Now, the funny thing about Python is that there are no curly braces to indicate where your code blocks happen, so the system actually uses your indentation to decide when, which lines of code belong with the if and which lines of code belong with the else. So if you get your indentation wrong, woe be to you. Your Python is going to read your code wrong. Also, there is no plus plus operator in Python. I don't know why. They just didn't like that operator. They didn't include it. For else if in C++, there's actually an elif operator in Python that just shortens else if into one single word, elif. I'm not sure why, but they like it. There is a one-line conditional in Python, just like there's a one-line conditional in C++. Minimum equals A less than B, question mark A, colon B is the C++ way to do it. In Python, you say minimum equals A if A is less than B, else B. It's a little more readable, I suppose. The while loop in Python looks a lot like the if statement in Python. You have while A less than B, colon, and then again you use your indentation to indicate which pieces go with the while loop and which pieces don't. In Python, you can have an else statement that ends the while loop with a particular extra statement or two. C++ doesn't have that, but you don't really need it because whatever you write after the while loop is going to be executed after the while loop. The for loop in Python works kind of like the alternate for loop in C++, the C++11 for loop, where you can say for int p colon primes, do the following. In Python, you say for p in primes, colon, and then you use your indentation again to mark what lines go with the for loop. This is going to print the sum of the first 7 primes, it looks like. If you want to do a counting loop, C++ makes that a lot easier than Python. C++, you say int x equals 0, x less equal 180, x plus equals 15. For Python, you have to say for x in range 0, comma, 1 past where you want to stop, comma, and then your step size. To define functions in C++, you give void and a function without a return value or a return type and then a function name. In Python, you use the def keyword to define a function. I guess def means define function. And you don't have to define a return type because, again, Python is dynamically typed. It automatically determines your type for you. If I want to average a bunch of numbers in C++, I have to give the length of the array. In Python, my arrays automatically keep track of their own size, so they're much more like vectors in C++. Okay. In Python, we don't refer to them as arrays or vectors. We call them lists. And lists are defined by just typing a bunch of numbers surrounded by square brackets. So nums equals square bracket 3, 2, 1. We can append 4, which just will now make it 3, 2, 1, 4. We can say size equals len of nums, so that's the length. Here, I think Python made an error in their usual readability. Why not just use the word length instead of len? And then we say print the list has size items. Sorting is a lot easier in Python. You just say nums.sort. And you can actually print a list in Python just by saying print and then the name of the list, and it will print the entire list for you. In Python, defining classes is a lot more complicated. You have a init instead of a constructor with the same name. And every function that belongs to the class has to take the class's self pointer as a parameter. So it gets a little confusing trying to define functions for classes in Python, or at least I find it a little confusing. How you use it, you say myself equals person of quote James, comma 44, and I can say print myself.name, and that'll print James. I can say myself.print, and that'll print 44. You'll notice there's none of the private and public in the way classes are handled in Python. So we don't have the same level of encapsulation, and it's not quite as ideal a object-oriented programming language as C++ or Java. Okay, finally, an example of Python code. This is a Python script that displays a web page. So it starts by importing a library called CGI, which is a common way to provide data to web pages in HTML. It's going to print the initial HTTP headers, HTML headers. Then it's going to make a connection to a SQL server. Okay. So note that we don't have to import everything up at the top like we usually do in C++. We can decide, oh, I need PyMySQL now, so I'm going to import that in the middle of my program. And then I'm going to call a function that has a lot of named parameters. So I actually have to put the parameter name equals the value that I'm giving it in all of these places. Here's a function that's supposed to post the meets from the available meets from a swim meet or from a swim meet server. You can see it uses print to send the actual HTML to the web page. And there are similar functions to post the list of swimmers and the swimmer data for a particular meet. And then finally, at the end of our Python example is where we actually hit the main program. If meet ID is not in your CGI query, then you're going to post all the meets. Else, if meet ID, we're going to query the meet ID. If swimmer ID is not in the query, we're going to post all the swimmers. Else, we'll get the swimmer ID, and then we're going to post just the swimmer data. And then we close our HTML by printing /body/HTML. Okay, I realize this has been a whirlwind tour of Python. I don't expect you to learn Python from this video. I just expect you to get an idea of how a very different language than C++ approaches doing all the things that we've learned how to do in C++ this semester. Okay, this wraps up my lectures for Programming 101, basically. So we're going to, there will be a quiz on programming languages, and then you'll be cleared to take the final exam. So one last time, good luck and happy programming.